I suppose it's not inappropriate to have started this story in a castle. This, after all, is the image most of us have in our minds when we conjure up the medieval world. We either think romantically of knights in armor, sporting their ladies' colors, jousting, the world of chivalry. Or we think of siege towers and burning oil, the constant bloodletting of those distant days. And heaven knows this part of England saw more trouble than most. The border with Wales was a buffer zone between hostile nations, and the Norman barons who built their castles here were charged by the king to police this front line. But here's the thing. My story over the next couple of hours isn't the story of kings and barons. It's the story of everyone else. It's our story, the story of ordinary people. And that means that my exploration of the medieval world has to get beyond the castle, out into the countryside. All right, so let's set the scene. We're in the early Norman period, 1066. The Normans had defeated the Saxons at Hastings, and a whole class of Saxon lords, the so-called thanes, had lost their lands. Many had lost their lives. But really, for the vast majority of the Saxon people, life continued much as before. They lived in villages, scattered across the English countryside. They worked the village lands. The only difference now was that the lord of the manor wasn't Saxon, he was Norman. I've come to visit one of the loveliest manor houses in England, a place called Stokesay in Shropshire. The earliest parts of this building date from the 12th century, but there's been a manor here at Stokesay since the days of the conquest. It was the property back then of a Saxon lord, a man called Ealdred. But after the conquest, it passed into the hands of a Norman called Roger de Lacy. Now, the reason I know who owned Stokesay back then is because, like many places in England, Stokesay is mentioned in the Domesday Book. 20 years into his reign, William the Conqueror had commissioned a survey of all the lands of England. He had had every manor listed by value to know how much tax they owed. And for the historian, this Domesday Book is an astonishing gift because it enables us to transport ourselves back 900 years to a place like Stokesay and to populate this manor with its full complement of medieval characters. And I quote, "In the manor of Stokesay, there are 16 serfs and maidserfs, and 20 villeins with 8 ox teams, and 9 women cottagers, and a miller grinding corn, and a keeper of bees." There's nothing left of the village that must have been here once, where all those serfs and villeins, the different ranks of medieval peasant, lived. The rich built in stone. They made their mark on posterity, but the poor, they lived in timber-framed longhouses with walls of interwoven branches packed with mud. It's all decayed over time. It's frustrating. All that remains is a mound of earth further downriver where the mill once stood. And you head out into the fields beyond Stokesay. Same problem. It seems so timeless. And there's a joy knowing you're walking the same earth those peasants walked 900 years ago. But the landscape has changed beyond recognition. Nowadays, this land is pasture, grazing land for sheep and cattle. Back in the 11th century, though, we had a rapidly expanding population. And we were dependent on growing crops, wheat, barley, peas, beans, and every inch of available land was put to the plough, and this was hard work, intensive work. The farmer that owns this land, Mr. Marsh, he's got tractors, he's got combine harvesters. He could plough and sow those fields up there in a week. He could harvest them in a couple of days. Back in the 11th century, that kind of work would have taken the entire village. The process of putting food on the table tied up the vast majority of the English population to a life of service here in the fields. What you'd have seen back then, up here in the fields above Stokesay, was a life of hard graft. The land was arranged in the medieval fashion, 3 large open fields divided into strips, each the width of an ox team. Villains worked their own strips, enough to feed their families, and then gave half the week in unpaid service on the manor lands. Serfs had no strips of their own. They worked day in, day out for the lord of the manor. They were little better than slaves. The theory was, in return for labor, the lord of the manor offered the village protection. And there must have been occasions when the church bell rang a warning, and the peasants sought refuge here, carrying their precious chickens, herding their livestock into the sanctuary of the manor. But the fact is, by the time this great hall was built in the 13th century, the threat of Welsh raiding parties was long gone. Peace reigned in England, but the obligation to work unpaid for the lord of the manor continued. There are records of manor courts held in great halls like this. They were village gatherings held 3 or 4 times a year, an opportunity for villagers to sort out grievances in this communal way of life. So-and-so's pig has trampled so-and-so's crops, you get the idea. But most of all, what you read in the pages of these manorial records are a list of fines, punishments for those villagers that broke the rules. 2d for failing to thresh the Lord's corn, 4d for marrying without his consent, 6d for leaving the village without permission. And in a way, I suppose the story I've got to tell in this program is the story of how we as a nation emerged from the shackles of manor life, how we broke free from the confines of the village, the field, how we became the people we are today.